January the 17th, 1945, Clark Air Base, Philippines. The sun hung low over the tarmac, casting long amber shadows across rows of P-38 Lightnings and Corsairs lined in perfect formation. The air smelled of aviation fuel and tropical rain-soaked earth. A young American pilot, Lieutenant William Shomo, sat in his cockpit adjusting his oxygen mask with the same measured calm he might use buttoning a Sunday shirt. His breathing was steady, his hands moved without tremor. Around him, the engine chorus rose, not in frantic urgency, but in disciplined sequence, each propeller finding its rhythm as if conducting a symphony rather than preparing for war. 300 miles to the north, Japanese ace pilot Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai watched this same sky from a different vantage. He had flown since 1937. He had survived China, Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, and the furnace of the Solomon Islands. He had painted 64 kill marks on fuselages that no longer existed. And in the quiet moments between missions, in the letters he would later write, and the interviews he would give to stunned American historians, he confessed something that contradicted everything his empire had taught him. American pilots flew as if death was merely an engineering problem to be solved. This was not how wars were supposed to be won. The Japanese military philosophy was built on spirit, on Bushido, the soul of the warrior transcending steel and flesh. From the earliest days of flight training at Tsuchiura Air Base, cadets were taught that willpower could bend physics, that devotion to the emperor could overcome material deficiency. They trained with inadequate fuel rations. They flew planes held together with salvaged parts. They were told that one Japanese pilot, burning with righteous fury, equaled 10 Americans softened by luxury and moral decay. Sakai himself had believed this once, had flown into battle with that fire in his chest, had watched American formations and assumed their precision was rigidity, their calmness a mask for fear. He had been wrong. The first time Sakai engaged American Navy pilots over Guadalcanal in August 1942, he expected chaos. He expected them to scatter like startled birds when his Zero came screaming from the sun. Instead, they tightened formation. Instead, they communicated short, clipped radio calls he could barely intercept and maneuvered not as individuals seeking glory, but as a single organism redistributing threat. When he shot down 2 wildcats, the remaining 4 did not flee. They did not charge in vengeful rage. They calculated, they repositioned. One drew him into a climbing turn, while another locked onto his 6 with patience that felt inhuman. Sakai escaped that day, but the image haunted him. American pilots treating aerial combat like a geometry exam. By 1943, Japanese intelligence reports began cataloguing something they could not explain. Captured American training manuals revealed syllabi that seemed absurd in their thoroughness. American pilots received over 300 hours of flight training before combat deployment. Japanese pilots, by that point in the war, were receiving 60. Americans practiced instrument flying in simulated night conditions, navigation using radio beacons, gunnery with live ammunition against towed targets. They trained in link trainers, mechanical simulators that replicated flight conditions without burning precious fuel. They studied aerodynamics, meteorology, aircraft recognition from every angle. They were drilled in emergency procedures until bailout sequences became muscle memory. The Japanese High Command read these reports and dismissed them. Overtraining, they concluded. Luxury making men soft. But the men who faced these pilots in the air knew better. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroi, flying from Rabaul, recorded in his diary after a mission against B-17 formations. They do not waver. Even when their aircraft is on fire, the pilot continues his bombing run as if completing a checklist. This is not courage. It is something colder. It is process. Another pilot, whose name was lost when his carrier sank at Philippine Sea, wrote to his sister, The Americans fly like factory workers assembling the same part 10,000 times. There is no hesitation, no second guessing. When we improvise, they adapt. When we attack with spirit, they respond with mathematics. The symbolic object that came to represent this chasm was not a weapon. It was the checklist, a simple, laminated card clipped to the cockpit panel. Japanese pilots flew by instinct, by feel, by the warrior's intuitive bond with his machine. American pilots flew by procedure. Before every takeoff, fuel mixture, magnetos, trim tabs, flaps. During combat, check 6, check instruments, manage speed, conserve ammunition, communicate position. If the engine failed, there was a checklist. If hydraulics died, there was a checklist. If you were hit and bleeding and the Pacific stretched grey and endless below, there was still a checklist, and following it might save your life. To the Japanese, this seemed like spiritual weakness, the inability to transcend technique and achieve unity with the act of flight. To the Americans, it was the distillation of 10,000 accumulated lessons, each written in the blood of pilots who had made a mistake once and could not make it again. The checklist was not a crutch. It was institutional memory made tangible. It was democracy's answer to the warrior cult. We do not need heroes who burn bright and die young. We need systems that turn ordinary men into consistent, lethal professionals. Saburo Sakai would survive the war, one of the few aces to do so. In 1957, he toured the United States at the invitation of former adversaries. He visited Naval Air Station Pensacola and watched young pilots train. He saw the simulators, the classrooms with blackboards covered in equations, the gunnery ranges with computerized scoring. He watched an instructor calmly correct a student's landing approach, watched the student nod and repeat the procedure until it was flawless. And Sakai wept, not from shame, but from recognition. He told his American hosts, "We were taught that spirit could overcome all obstacles. You were taught that preparation eliminates obstacles before they arise. I flew with courage. You flew with certainty. Courage fails. Certainty endures." The records bear this out with brutal clarity. In the 1942, the kill ratio between Japanese and American naval aviators was roughly even. Japan's superior experience and the Zero's agility balanced American numbers. By 1943, the ratio had shifted to 3-1 in America's favor. By 1944, it was 10-1. By the war's end, newly trained Japanese pilots were lasting an average of 3 combat missions. American pilots were completing 30, 40, returning home to train the next generation, passing down not mysticism but methods. The Hellcat, the Corsair, they were fine machines, but machines require hands that know every rivet and gauge. Japan built the A6M0 lighter and more maneuverable than anything in the sky, and it dominated until American pilots learned its weaknesses, documented them, trained every squadron to exploit them. Spirit met system. System won. There was a philosophical dimension to this that military historians would debate for decades. The Japanese emphasis on individual warrior excellence versus the American emphasis on institutional competence reflected deeper cultural truths. Japan's militarism was hierarchical, romantic, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition that valorized the transcendent individual. America's military doctrine was industrial, pragmatic, born from a society that valued replicable success over singular genius. Japanese aces were irreplaceable. When Hiroyoshi Nishizawa died, his skills died with him. American aces were products of a system. When Richard Bong returned from the Pacific with 40 kills, he became an instructor, and his lessons lived in every pilot he trained. The calm precision that Japanese pilots could not believe was not natural talent, it was engineered. It was the result of a nation that approached war the way it approached manufacturing automobiles. Break the process into steps, train each step until it is reflexive, assemble competent parts into a superior whole. There was no poetry in it. There was only effectiveness, and effectiveness, repeated across thousands of pilots and tens of thousands of sorties, became overwhelming. The recurring image that haunted Japanese accounts was the American pilot's face, not twisted in rage or fear, but blank, focused, eyes scanning instruments, hands making micro-adjustments, voice calm on the radio, even as tracers stitched past the canopy. Lieutenant Kuro wrote, "It is like fighting men who are already dead. They do not feel the battle, they execute the battle." What he mistook for absence of feeling was actually the presence of trust in training, in wingmen, in procedures honed through repetition until they required no conscious thought. The American pilot was not suppressing emotion. He was operating in a mental state where emotion was irrelevant because every contingency had been anticipated and rehearsed. This was America's ideological weapon, more potent than the Hellcat's engine or the proximity fuse, the belief that ordinary people, given proper training and resources, could achieve extraordinary results, not through mystical warrior spirit, but through preparation, not through feudal loyalty, but through professional competence. The Japanese pilot was an artist, improvising in the moment. The American pilot was a technician executing a plan. When both met in the sky, artistry could triumph in isolated encounters, but technique won the campaign. By the final year of the war, the gap had become unbridgeable. Japanese training programs had collapsed under fuel shortages and losses of experienced instructors. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 20 hours of flight time, some unable to land consistently. They were sent against American formations that moved with the precision of migratory birds, each aircraft positioned to provide mutual support, each pilot's eyes covering another's blind spot. The Japanese called these formations iron walls. They were not metaphorical. To attack one American bomber meant entering the interlocking fire of 50 machine guns. To pursue one fighter meant 4 others converging on your position. Individual skill meant nothing against collective competence. Sakai would reflect on this in his memoir, Samurai. We Japanese, in our arrogance, believed that technique was inferior to spirit. We learned too late that the Americans possessed both, but they made technique primary because they understood that spirit without skill is just noise and smoke. He described watching a young American pilot hit and losing altitude over Truck Lagoon calmly transmit his position, his heading, his rate of descent, all while preparing to ditch in shark-infested waters. The pilot's voice never wavered. He followed the checklist even as the ocean rushed up. A Catalina flying boat would fish him out 3 hours later. Sakai said, "That is when I knew we had lost the war. Not because of their ships or their bombs, but because they had built a system that treated survival as a science rather than a gamble." The epilogue of this story is written not in the war's final battles, but in its aftermath. The United States Air Force, born from the Army Air Corps, would institutionalize the lessons learned in the Pacific and Europe. Standardized training, procedural discipline, constant refinement of tactics based on data analysis. The fighter pilot would become not a knight-errant, but a professional warrior, as competent and reliable as the aircraft he flew. Japan, rebuilt from ashes, would adopt these same principles. The Japan Air Self-Defense Force would train its pilots in methods learned from former enemies, embracing the checklist and the simulator, and the philosophy that preparation is the highest form of respect for the mission. The calm precision that Japanese pilots could not believe was never about suppressing humanity. It was about amplifying human potential through structure. It was the assertion that freedom and discipline are not opposites, but partners, that a democratic society, investing in its people and trusting them with knowledge and tools, can produce warriors as formidable as any cult of death. The checklist clipped to the American pilot's panel was a small thing, laminated paper covered in simple words, but it represented a vast idea that we need not be born exceptional to achieve exceptional things, that courage is amplified rather than diminished by preparation, and that the true strength of a nation lies not in the fanaticism of its warriors, but in the competence of its citizens. Lieutenant William Shomo, who began this story, adjusting his oxygen mask with steady hands, would shoot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission on that January day. He would receive the Medal of Honor, and he would return to Ohio, become a flight instructor, and teach 300 young pilots the procedures that had kept him alive. His students would teach others. The system would perpetuate. And somewhere in that chain of knowledge, passed hand to hand across generations, lived the answer to the question that haunted Japanese pilots: how do they stay so calm? The answer was always simple: they trained until calm was all that remained.